Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Hello, everybody. Let's get things started. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've got your shot glasses ready. Let's just jump into mispronouncing some Gurdjieff words. So last week we were talking about Ashiyatashayamash and his descent or incarnation into the world. One of the teachers, the mystical teachers that actually had an effect on the human race. So sorry, I'm just reading what Tyler's comment. Yes, memeing is a very busy job. Now, okay. So let me just move this over here. Let's just jump straight into it, guys. Chapter 27. Hello, my yellow boy. Hello, Sarah. Nice to see you here as well. The organization for man's existence, created by the very saintly Ashiyatashayamash, it's the judge and jury are still out on. We're not quite sure who he is. Maybe he's a combo of Zarathustra and Hermes Trismegistus. We'll see what other little tidbits Gurdjieff drops us on our journey. So, Beelzebub continued to relate further as follows. My further researches and investigations also cleared up for me that after the very saintly Ashiyatashayamash had pondered on the mountain Veziniyama, and it's kind of like, you ever read Nietzsche's Zarathustra, how it starts off with him on top of a mountain? It makes me wonder if he's just taking his cues from like Nietzsche's Zarathustra here. Anyway, Veziniyama, and had formulated in his mind a definite plan for his further most saintly activities. So if we remember, Ashiyatashayamash, he incarnated into a poor family. He went to Babylon, realized everyone was just had everything wrong. They were just wrong. It's like, imagine you incarnating and then going to Burning Man and being like, oh god, no, this is terrible. Then he went, isolated himself, and he balanced himself, and then in a certain state, he developed himself up to a certain degree and then has developed himself further. So now he's seeking ways to further his saintly activities. So he did not again return to the city of Babylon, but went straight to the capital city, Julfapal. So once again, this is possibly a made-up name or a composite name, meaning something, of the country then called Kurlantek, which was situated in the middle of the continent of Asia. So this is what, are we still prehistory here? Middle of the continent Asia. Get the hell away from here. So he means somewhere like around here. When he's saying Asia, he means around here. So like right in the middle. Maybe it's somewhere near Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. Because the whole deal is he had prehistory Babylon around here, prehistory China there, and then like prehistory India. So if you've got those three triangulating it, does he include Russia in all that, in Asia, when he's talking? So it's either going to be smack dam like there, or it's going to be like around here, where Tibet is. Ashiyatashayamash went to Tibet. Maybe. There, he first of all established relations with the brethren of the then existing brotherhood Chaftantori. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Is the T silent? Can we just go Chaftantori? Chaftantori, a name signifying to be or not to be at all. Okay, a little bit of Shakespeare, a little bit of Hamlet. To be. We're all focusing on our beings. To be. Better to be or just not to be. But you don't want to be in the middle, bruh. Which had its quarters not far from that city. So, in Kurlantek, no, in Julfapal, there is a brotherhood outside of Julfapal in the country of Kurlantek, is a secret brotherhood named Chaff Tanturi. This said brotherhood was founded 5 of their years before the arrival of the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash. So does that mean, like, before his incarnation? Or literally 5 years before the dude just rocked up? It would have taken time to establish the brotherhood, so I'm feeling like before he was born. But anyway, these time periods are very subjective nonetheless. On the initiative of 2 genuine terrestrial initiates. Okay, so 2 initiates founded this, who had become initiates according to the principles existing, as it was then said there, before the Ashiatan epoch. So they were initiates to a very high degree, but then Ashiata Shayamash came and just changed everything. Everything is post-Ashiata then, like Plato. There was philosophy before Plato, and then after Plato, it's all post-Platonic now. The name of one of these 2 terrestrial 3-brained beings of that time, who had become genuine initiates there, was Poundolero, and the other was Sensi Mirinico? Sensi and Pounds. What are these guys, like JoJo characters? Poundolero, Sensi Mirinico. Okay, that sounds like an Italian dude and his Asian housewife. Started a secret brotherhood. I must remark, by the way, that both of these 2 terrestrial genuine initiates of that time had already by then coated in their common presences their higher being parts to the gradation called completion. Okay, this is interesting. Remember, whenever he talks about higher being bodies, this is when we pay attention. And hence they had time during their further existence to perfect these higher being parts. So this is interesting. You can complete the work, but even after completion, there's still there's not a further work, but there's still a refinement, you could say. So, like, you know, if you compare the work to mining, like, you can dig a gem out of the ground, but you still got to polish it, kind of thing. Pound and dollar mashed, says Tyler. Yeah, I don't know. Poundolero. Maybe, yeah. Are these like, I don't know, Sensi Mironico? Mironico just sounds so like something. It could be that they're some kind of bend in the names of currencies and other countries or something, but I don't know. Moving on, Tyler, moving on. So they have completed, hence they had time during their further existence to further perfect their higher parts of theirs to the required gradation of sacred objective reason. So not just objective reason, sacred objective reason. And now their perfected higher being parts have even become worthy to have already, and already now have the place of their further existence on the holy planet Purgatory. What is that, chapter 30-36? Coming up soon. Keep your eyes out for that one. That one's the important chapter, Planet Purgatory. So this is interesting. So these guys completed their higher being bodies, and they perfected them in their lives, which I then afterwards, they were able to, they're now able to go to Holy Planet Purgatory and do an even further thing, beyond man number 7. So, according to my latest investigations, when in all the separate spiritualized parts of the common presences of these 2 3-brained beings of that period, Poundolero and Sensimirenico, there arose and was continually sensed the suspicion, which later became a conviction, that owing to some obviously non-lawful causes, something very undesirable, thank you for the hearts, whoever's sending them, for them personally had been acquired and had begun to function in their general organization, and that at the same time it was possible for this something very undesirable to be removed from themselves by means of their own data within themselves. So this is obviously the discovery about inner urgency. You know, you kind of realize at one point in life, you're like, there's something wrong with myself. Maybe I'm the problem. You know, we all have that realization. So they're realizing there's something in them that's wrong, but they're also realizing that you can remove that thing or something can be done about it. But the data you need is you need to collect a certain amount of data for that. So they're collecting the data, their own internal data. They then sought several other beings like themselves who were striving for the same aim, in order, together, to try to achieve the removal from themselves of this said something very undesirable. And when they soon found beings responding to this aim amongst what are called the monks of places called monasteries, of which there were already many of that period in the environs of that town, Julfapau, they, together with these monks chosen by them, founded the Brotherhood. So the two brothers started working, and then them and some monks got together and founded a brotherhood. So after arriving in the town, Julfapau, the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash, and so they did all this like 5 years before Ashiata Shaimash just arrived or was born. I know about that 5 years. I wonder if there's some kind of play on numbers happening here. There's the one, and then there's two brothers, and they're all three-brained beings. Something. We're missing a 4 there, and then 5 years later, Ashiata Shaimash comes. There's some kind of weird number play going on. Now, in the town Julfapau, the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash established corresponding relations with these brethren of the mentioned brotherhood, who were working upon that abnormally proceeding functioning of their psyche, which they themselves had constated, and he began enlightening their reason by means of objectively true information. Okay, so he gave them the objective truth, and guiding their being impulses in such a way that they could sense these truths without the participation either of the abnormally crystallized factors already within their presences. That's interesting. What is this? So he's guiding their being impulses that they could sense truths without the participation of their abnormally crystallized. So they have abnormal factors, they got egos, they got weird blinds, psychological blinds, but he's guiding their being impulses that they could still sense the truths despite their preconceptions, or the factors which might newly arise from the results of external perceptions they obtained from the abnormally established form of ordinary being existence. Okay, so he's guiding them further. While enlightening the brethren of the said brotherhood in the mentioned way and discussing his suppositions and intentions with them, the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash occupied himself at the same time in drawing up what are called the rules, or as it is also said there, statutes for this brotherhood, which he, in association with these brethren, he initiated of the former brotherhood, Chaftantori. Okay. Remember in in the last chapters, there was something about Ashiata Shaimash. All of his teachings had been lost except for a stone tablet kept by a random brotherhood in the middle of Asia. And there's also his way of teaching, it was said, was very enigmatic. He had a very sneaky way of teaching. So remember, keep those things in mind as we keep reading this chapter or keep reading about Ashiata Shaimash. Now, the former brother, founded in the town of Julfapau, and which later was called the Brotherhood, Hichtvori. He loves his T's and his V's right next to each other, this Gurji boy. Tvor. Which signified, only he will be called and will become the Son of God who acquires in himself conscience. So this is interesting. This is one thing that's interesting. Gurdjieff talks about consciousness, but he also talks about conscience. And in some languages, there's no difference. Like I'm pretty sure in French, conscience and consciousness is the same word, but he's using this in a different way. You are conscious, but your conscience is like something that awakens within you and then kind of guides you. Yes, Ciro says he is talking about the Mandeans in China that later became the White Lotus. Possibly. Yeah, maybe. That's a whole other rabbit hole. Later, when with the participation of these... Oh my god, I forgot to start recording. Fuck. Oh well. Later, when, with the participation of these brethren of the former brotherhood, Chaff Tantori, everything had been worked out and organized, the very saintly Ashiyatashaimash sent these same brethren to various places and commissioned them under his general guidance to spread the information that in the subconsciousness of people there are crystallized and are always present the data manifested from above for engendering in them the divine impulse of genuine conscience. So is he saying this as a blind, like just tell people this, or is this something true that he's telling them to go and tell them? And what he's telling them to tell people is that everybody has in their subconsciousness data that has descended from above, and it can engender within them genuine conscience. And that only he who acquires the ableness that the actions of these data participate in the functioning of that consciousness of theirs in which they pass their everyday existence, has in the objective sense the honest right to be called and really to be a genuine son of our common Father, Creator of all that exists. Okay, that's interesting. But there's a little... I don't know about that, but there's a little key somewhere there. He talks about in the subconscious. So we are conscious of certain things, and then there are things within us that we are not conscious of. Remember, I've heard, like in some spiritual groups I've been, you hear people talk, and every now and then I hear someone say some stuff like, I was observing my subconscious, or they'll like, yes, I was analyzing the subconscious, or I saw within myself. It's like, no, you didn't. No. If you close your eyes and you meditate, and you become conscious of a psychic process within you, via definition, if you are conscious of a mental process, it's not your subconsciousness. So there's something within us that we are not conscious of. It is data manifested from above that can engender within us the divine impulse of genuine conscience. And this seems to be something we need to do early. Like, before crystallizing higher being bodies, we need to get balanced and we need to develop conscience. The little angel on the shoulder. It seems the angel on the shoulder isn't automatic. It's something that needs to be developed or that needs to be released. Jungian dream work. I mean, Jungian dream work is a style of interacting with the subconscious, unconscious regions. So that's one technique. The problem with, and even stuff like path working, that stuff is also there as well, but anything that uses imagination, a lot of that stuff is a bit hard, because it's not hard. It's just that a lot of people can become really delusional really easily, which you know why. It's very easy when this is why Gurdjieff was always against imagination practices. When it's too easy for imagination to become fantasy, basically. That's the crux of the problem. You do get people like Jung who can do it. Like, it's not that the techniques are useless, it's just that I feel like if you gave it to 10 people, at least 7 of them would become a little delusional. And there's always that one guy that starts off already kind of delusional. It just makes them like completely fucking... Sorry, I should have sworn. It makes them completely like, I am an incarnation of Jesus. No. But anyway, moving on. So, these brethren then preached this objective truth, at first chiefly among the monks of the mentioned monasteries, many of which, as I've already said, existed in the environs of the town itself. So Ashiyatashaimash came to a monastery with the 2 initiates, trained everyone, and then the monks then went to other monasteries and spread the results. The result of these preachings of theirs was that they first of all selected 35 serious and well-prepared what are called novices of this first brotherhood, Hichdevori, which they founded in the city Julfapal. You really want me to say this again and again, don't you, Gurdjieff? Jul for power. What other word has a D and a J? It's also Jartklom in some of those other chapters, which were like, clearly that was where he was talking about alchemy. Basically, just pure alchemy. God damn, it's the D's and J's and the T's and the V's next to each other. And Pak Dolg duty, oh god. Thereafter, the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash, while continuing to enlighten the minds of the former brethren of the Brotherhood Chaftantori, then began, with the help of these brethren, to enlighten the reason of those 35 novices. Ciro says, in Brazil, there is a guy famous for being Gurdjieff? Is it Jesus incarnation? Yeah. Oh, Djembe, says Tyler. Yeah. There's a lot of guys. There's a lot of guys who are incarnate as Jesus nowadays. Oof. Big oof for them. So, it continued during the whole of one of their years, and only after this did some of them from among the brethren of the former brotherhood Chaftantori, and from among the 35 said novices, gradually prove worthy to become what are called all the rights possessing brethren of the first brotherhood, Hichtvori. So now there's bureaucracy in the brotherhood. Well, there's levels, I should say. There's levels of initiates. According to the statutes drawn up by the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash. Also, you know, he mentioned the Akhaldan society in Atlantis, and he said nothing ever like it came about, but clearly here is another society that is growing post-Atlantis, which... is it going to be as great as the Akhaldan? Let's see what happens. So, very saintly Ashiata Shamash, any brother could become an all the rights possessing brother of the Brotherhood Hichtvori, only when, in addition to the other also foreseen definite objective attainments, he could bring himself, in the sense of ableness of conscious direction of the functioning of his own psyche. So, you can consciously direct your own psyche. That is one of the attainments that you need to attain before you're accepted as a all the rights possessing brother of the Brotherhood Hichtvori. So to be able to know how to convince to perfection 100 other beings and to prove to them that the impulse of being objective conscience exists in man. Okay, so you need to be able to direct people's consciousness to be able to apprehend that. And secondly, how it must be manifested in order that a man may respond to the real sense and aim of his existence. Gotta go fast. And moreover, so to convince them that each of these others, in their turn, should acquire in themselves what is called the required intensity of ableness. So they need to be able to do the work. They need to realize that there is a work to be done, and they need to be able to do it and also want to do it. To be able to convince and persuade not less than 100 others also. So this is interesting. This also is a mechanism to perpetuate the teachings. So you teach a guy and he teaches 100 people, and then each one person that he teaches also teaches another 100 people. That's interesting. That seems to be the required intensity of ableness. To be able to convince and persuade not less than 100 others. Maybe you don't need to do another 100, but if you can get if you gain initiation and you can initiate 2 people, that's at least a little bit of a spread. It was those who became worthy to become such an all the rights possessing brother of the Brotherhood Hichtvori, who were first called by the name of priest. For your complete elucidation concerning the very saintly activities of Ashiata Shaimash, you must also know that afterwards, when all the results of the very saintly labors of the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash were destroyed, both this word priest there and also the word initiate, about which I have already told you, were used and still continue to be used by your favorites down to the present time in 2 quite different senses. So that's interesting. So the first name of priest. Okay, so priest and initiate used to be have the same meaning, and now they don't. In one sense, this word priest was since then and now still is commonly used, but only in certain places and for unimportant separate groups of those professionals existing there whom everybody now calls their confessors or clergymen. And in the other sense, those beings were called, and are still called by this word, priests, who by their pious existence and by the merits of their acts performed for the good of those around them, stand out so much from the rank and file of the ordinary three-brained beings there, that whenever these ordinary beings there have occasion to remember them, there arises and proceeds in their presences the process called gratitude. What? So priests are basically just clergymen or good dudes who work really hard. Oh. Already during that same period, or is this also initiates? People who give great gratitude. Let's keep reading. Let's move on. Moving forward. Already during the same period, while the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash was enlightening the reason of the brethren of the former brotherhood Chaftantori, as well as of the newly collected 35 novices, there began to spread among ordinary beings of the city Julfapal and its environs the true idea that in the common presences of men beings, all the data exists for the manifestation of the divine impulse conscience. Now, is this correct? Because people say, all you need is within you, and it's like, yeah, So this idea first came from Ashiata Shaimash's group, but is it correct? But that this divine impulse does not take part in their general consciousness. Yes. And then so you need something to help it take part. You need okay, it's all within you, but you need to access it. How do you do that? And then it takes no part, because although their manifestations bring them certain what are called quite late repaying satisfactions, and considerable material advantage, nevertheless, they thereby gradually atrophy the data put into their presences by nature for evoking in other beings around them, without distinction of brain system, the objective impulse of divine love. So there's something in us that's quite natural, and it just atrophies over time. Makes sense. This true, and by atrophy, it means it sinks deeper into the subconscious until we lose all connection with it. This true information began to spread. Okay, so it is true. So there is something in our subconscious. This true information began to spread, thanks chiefly to the superlatively wise provision of the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash, which obliged everyone striving to become an all-the-rights-possessing brother of the brotherhood Hichtavori to attain, as I have already told you, in addition to all kinds of definite self-merits, the ableness to know how to convince all the three separate spiritualized and associating parts of a further 100 three-brained beings there concerning the divine impulse. So when you convince someone, it's not just intellectual. You need to convince them emotionally, and you need to convince them in their gut, their instinct. So, you know, when you hear a lawyer speak or you hear a politician on TV, they can rationally sound like, well, nowadays not, but it used to be that they can rationally sound everything's correct. Like, everything's correct, but deep down in your gut, you're like, oh, this lawyer, he's saying something, it's going to screw me over, but you can't rationally tease out what he's saying. But instinctually, you know something's wrong. Or it can be the other way. Instinctually, you know something's right, but you can't rationally find the logic for it. So there's a disjoint in your being brains. So what he's teaching people to become able, their ableness, is their ableness to convince all three parts of an individual of something true, nonetheless. It's easy to deceive all three parts of someone. But to convince someone of something that is true is hard. So when the organization of the first brotherhood, Hichtavori, in the city Julfapal, had been more or less regulated and was so established that the further work could already be continued independently by means only of the direction issuing from the reason then present in the brotherhood, then the very saintly Ashiata Shaimash himself selected from among those who had become all the rights-possessing brothers of the brotherhood, those who had already sensed the said divine impulse consciously by their reason and unconsciously by the feelings in their subconsciousness. So that's interesting. So you can connect to it unconsciously through feeling, Or you can connect to it consciously via reason. Being reason. And who had full confidence that by certain self-efforts this divine being impulse might become and forever remain an inseparable part of their ordinary consciousness. That's the goal. Higher states of consciousness are all well and good, but what you want to do is change permanently your ordinary state of consciousness. And those who had sensed and become aware of this divine conscience, and who were called first-degree initiates, he set apart, and he began to enlighten their reason separately concerning these objective truths, which before that time were still quite unknown to the three-brained beings. It was just these outstanding first-degree initiated beings, who were then called great initiates. Tyler says, sounds like the inner work required in the chariot in the later meditation. Sorry, maybe. Yeah. Here it must be remarked that those principles of being of the initiated beings there, which were later on called their Ashiata's renewals, were then renewed by the very saintly Ashiata Shamash. What did that even mean? What did that even mean? God damn. Damn it, Gurdjieff. Damn it, Gurdjieff. So we have great initiates. I'm thinking about that as well, the chariot and the later meditations on the Tara. Here it must be remarked that those principles of the beings of being of the initiated beings there, which were later on called Ashiata's renewals, were then renewed. So renewed by what does this even mean? Okay, let's keep going. Let's see what if he reclarifies what that says. Well, then it was to those same great initiates who were first set apart that the very saintly Ashiata Shamash, now already the most very saintly. I feel like Gurdjieff knows about Freemasonry. If you know anything about Freemasonry, they always give each other titles like, what is it? They call each other brethren, but then they say like, worshipful brethren. And then they'll say most worshipful brethren, and they just kind of keep adding on very most worshipful brethren. Like words as an addendum on the end of brethren. But anyway, the most very saintly then, among other things, also elucidated in detail what this being impulse objective conscience is, and how factors arise for its manifestation in the presence of the three-brained beings. And concerning this, he once said as follows. So this seems really light. It seems like, he's making this brotherhood, and the great initiates are just people who have kind of connected to conscience. Although this could be what a fourth man is supposed to what a fourth man is supposed to do. Like once you're, man 1, 2, and 3, and once you're the fourth man, the balanced man, you're supposed to connect to conscience. So he's kind of giving you what you're supposed to do. Very worshipful dude, brah, says Ghoul and Tyler. Yeah, basically. So the factors for the being impulse conscience arise in the presences of the three-brained beings from the localization of the particles of the emanations of the sorrow. Okay, here we go. What is this? What is this? Emanations of the sorrow. That's an interesting translation, but Gurdjieff talks about remorse, where, normal Christians would talk about repentance, and nowadays that word has become corrupted because, repentance, you just think of hitting yourself with a whip. Just whipping the nay-nay, but that's not what repentance is supposed to be. What's the ancient Greek word? Metanoia, which means to turn around. It's an action. It literally means to turn away, but it's an action to completely transform yourself to never do it again. So that's true repentance, or true repentance is remorse. There is so emanations of the sorrow, particles as well. These particles of sorrow arise within you, thanks to the factors of the being impulse of conscience. And this is what actually allows you to change. Because we want to change, we want to transform. And it's tough, bro. It's tough. So there's some kind of high voltage emotion, which is felt through conscience, which is something in us that is buried in our subconsciousness. Anyway, of our omni-loving and long-suffering endlessness creator. Okay, that's interesting. And so the remorse that you feel is actually coming from God. You participate in the sorrow of God. Because there's this other thing as well, like God, if God is an absolute, then capital G God is absolute, then every single being in existence that has been and will be are all within the absolute. That means all of their suffering, all of the suffering of every single being that is around now, that has been and will ever be, is within God. So God must suffer a lot. So if you become an individuated being that differentiates themselves, you actually lift the burden of God. A little burden from God. You make him suffer less, even though the suffering is, for God, is eternal and infinite, technically. A reference to Binah, the third Sephirah? Possibly. True understanding. Anyway, let's keep going and let's see where he goes with this. So, the particles of sorrow come from omni-loving and long-suffering endless creator, from the absolute, basically. That's where it comes from. So, when we feel true remorse, it comes from something higher, is what he's saying. That is why the source of the manifestation of the genuine conscience in three-centered beings is sometimes called the representative of the creator. So it's as if God is chastising us. That is our conscience within us. That's one way you can cognize your conscience, is God chastising you. But really it's you. It's interesting. So particles of emanation that emanate from above get buried in our subconsciousness, which we have to reach the above by then going below, by going within us, by going into the subconsciousness and interacting with it. So there's an interesting dichotomy here to go up. To gain what we need from above, we need to go down. There's an interesting kind of paradox there. Alrighty. And this sorrow is formed in our all-maintaining common Father from the struggle constantly proceeding in the universe between joy and sorrow. Because I guess if God is absolute, he not only feels all the sorrow, but also all the joy. Happy, happy, joy, joy. He then also further said, in all three-brained beings of the whole of our universe without exception, among whom are also we men, owing to the data crystallized in our common presences for engendering in us the divine impulse of conscience, the whole of us and the whole of our essence are and must be already in our foundation, only suffering. What does that mean? And they must be suffering because the completed actualizing of the manifestation of such a being impulse in us can proceed only from the constant struggle of two quite opposite, what are called complexes of the functioning. Pardon me. Of the functioning of those two sources which are quite opposite origin. Namely, between the process of functioning of our planetary body itself and the parallel functions arising progressively from the coating and perfecting of our higher being bodies within this planetary body of ours, which functionings in their totality actualize every kind of reason in the three-centered beings. So that's interesting. So there seems to be a process that's just ongoing in all people of a kind of crystallizing of higher being bodies, but it just atrophies and goes wrong and we get perverted reason. But in some people it kind of goes right, and it seems conscience is a part of this. It's almost like, when you get a woman pregnant and the baby's gestating, what's the first part of the human that gets kind of, that grows, that crystallizes? What's the first part of the embryo? The first organ? It's the heart. So, in essence, your higher being body has faculties as well. It has eyes, it has arms, and these are perhaps faculties, maybe telekinesis, maybe clairvoyance. What's the first thing that grows? It would be the heart of the higher being body, and what faculty would connect to that heart would be the conscience. So connecting to conscience is basically coating of the heart of the higher being body. Very interesting. In consequence, and so he's saying something about suffering, and also this coating, this process that's going on, creates a suffering within us, almost like a suffering of a third person. There's our planetary body, there's this higher thing that wants to be, and there's this tension between them which creates a type of suffering. And that is our essence. Very interesting. Because he connects this suffering to our essence. So maybe because this is the whole thing, we're bracketed by desires, we're bracketed by psychological impulses, we live in a society, we have biology, all of this stuff is floating around within us, but we bracket it all away. And if you're not your emotions, if you're not your thoughts, your memories, your impulses, what's left? What is the seething background? There's this angst, there's this desire for something. And it's like this angst that wants to move, that wants to generate, that wants to be something higher. But we're not that yet. And so it creates a suffering. Is this what that suffering is? And is this our essence? A psychic organ in all of us? Yes. These are interesting reflections. Let's keep going. Keep going and see where he goes. In consequence of this, every three-centered being in our great universe, and also we men existing on the earth, must, owing to the presence in us also of the factors for engendering the divine impulse of objective conscience, always inevitably struggle with the arising and the proceeding within our common presences of two quite opposite functionings, giving results always sensed by us either as desires or as non-desires. That's interesting. So, in consequence of this, every three-centered being of our great universe, and also we men existing on the earth, must, owing to the presence in us, also the factors for engendering the divine impulse of objective conscience, always inevitably struggle with the arising and the proceeding within our common presences of two quite opposite functionings, giving the results always sensed in us either as desire or what is non-desires? What does he mean by this? What do you mean, Gurdjieff? Tell us, Gurdjieff. You mean aversions? Or non-desire? So our planetary body desires and our higher being body actually non-desires. What is that even? What? You're breaking me, Gurdjieff. You're breaking me. Okay. And so, no, my boys, only he who consciously assists the process of this inner struggle and consciously assists the non-desires. Okay, so non-desires is a kind of yearning of the conscience or the higher being body within us that's trying to crystallize itself to predominate over the desires, behaves just in accordance with the essence of our common Father Creator himself, whereas who with his consciousness assists the contrary only increases his sorrow. Very interesting. Okay, that's an interesting, his sorrow. Temptation and rewards for resistance of desires. I remember one guy, another fourth way guy, once talking about the sorrow of God, and he said God feels sorrow towards us in the same way that, imagine a parent training their kids for a play, and that you're teaching your kids, you're helping them with their lines, and then you're sitting down and the play's going on, and then the part happens and your kid comes out into stage and turns to the audience and it's their turn. They've got their lines to say and their mouth opens and their mind goes blank. And God is there, sitting there. You're a parent, you're sitting in the audience and you're looking at your kid like, oh fuck, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to help your kid. They're just there. They know all the lines. It's in their subconscious. Their consciousness just can't reach it. They've forgotten their lines and they don't know what to do in the play of life. And this is the sorrow that God feels when watching us. That's how he interpreted it. And it's interesting. It's when we come into life, we come into this play, and instead of doing our lines, We instead obeyed the desires of our planetary body, and God's like, oh, just face palming, like, oh, no, no, and it's increasing our sorrow. It increases our sorrow. He who with his consciousness assists the contrary only increases his sorrow. So increases his sorrow, and God's just like, oh God, oh, why? But if point of the work is we need to consciously assist we need to become conscious of these processes, higher processes, and assist them. So perhaps this is also like a Thelema thing, like this is finding our true will, is connecting to conscience within us, which is a particle of the common Father Creator himself. Oof. Big oof for God. Well, maybe God is looking at us and going oof. Now, owing to all I have just said, my boy, at that period, scarcely 3 years had passed when, on the one hand, all the ordinary beings of the town Julfapal and its environs, and also of many other countries of the continent Asia, not only already knew that this divine being impulse of genuine conscience was in them, and that it could take part in the functioning of their ordinary waking consciousness, and that in all the brotherhoods of the great prophet Ashyata Shaimash, all the initiates and priests elucidated and indicated how and what had to be done in order that such a divine impulse should take part in the functioning of the mentioned ordinary waking consciousness. But furthermore, nearly everybody even began to strive and exert himself to become priests of the brotherhood Hichtavori, of which many brotherhoods were already founded during that period and functioned almost independently in many other countries of the continent Asia. So it seems like there's a central brotherhood behind other brotherhoods. This is the esoteric brotherhood behind all the minor mystery brotherhoods, the kindergarten brotherhoods out in the world. And these almost independent brotherhoods arose there in the following order. When the common work of the brotherhood founded in the town Julfapal was finally established, the very saintly Ashyat Shaimash began sending the said great initiates with corresponding directions to other countries and towns of the continent Asia, in order to organize similar brotherhoods there also, while he himself remained in the town Julfapal, from where he guided the activities of these helpers. I'm getting like assassin vibes, you know, like, who's the guy in the mountain who had like, he was in some like mountain fortress and he had like telepathy or something and he'd send messages to his assassins? Or is that just like an oral story from the assassin tradition? It's hard nowadays. Assassin's Creed has ruined everything. Muddied the waters. Ubisoft. Anyway. However, it might have been, my boy. It then so turned out that almost all of your favorites, those strange three-brained beings, also wished and began to strive with all their spiritualized being parts to have in their ordinary waking consciousness the divine genuine objective conscience, and in consequence most of the beings of Asia at that time began to work upon themselves under the guidance of initiates and priests of the brotherhood Hichtavori, in order to transfer into their ordinary consciousness the results of the data present in their subconsciousness. Okay, so to transfer into their ordinary consciousness the results of the data presence in their subconsciousness. So they're building a bridge for engendering the impulse of the genuine divine conscience. So a bridge must be built. And in order to have the possibility, by this means, on the one hand, of completely removing from themselves, perhaps forever, the maleficent consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, that would be great. Both, you know what would suck, is you remove the consequences of the organ Kundabuffer, but then you reincarnate on Earth into a biological family that still has the consequences, and you just gotta do it all over again. Ghoul says Muhammad III of Ahmad, aka the Old Man of Mountain. Yes, that's the reference I'm thinking of. There's a little, I kind of got that vibe there when it's like, and I should have just stayed back. Thank you, Ghoul. Thank you. But I don't know if he's going to go with that. But anyway, so both those personally acquired and those passed to them by heredity, and on the other hand, of consciously taking part in diminishing the sorrow of our common endless Father. He wants us to become competent and fulfill our part in the play of life. Ghoul says, comes from Marco Polo. Okay, so Marco Polo originated the Old Man on the Mountain story. Interesting. Interesting. Okay, so keep going though. Owing to all this, the question of conscience already began to predominate at that period during the ordinary process of being existence, both in waking consciousness, both in waking conscious state and in the passive instinct state among your favorites, particularly among those who existed in the continent Asia. So passive instinct, is that sleep? Is that what you're saying? So the question of conscience already began to predominate, period of ordinary process of being existence in waking consciousness state. Yeah, that's what we want. So sometimes conscience may activate in a passive instinct state, and it may guide us through images, i.e. this is Jungian shadow therapy or dream therapy. Your dreams are your conscience trying to speak to you. But nonetheless, even those three-brained beings of that time in whose presences the taste of this divine impulse had not yet been transubstantiated, but who had in their strange peculiar consciousness proper to them alone only empty information concerning this being impulse, which could be present in them as well, also exerted themselves to manifest in everything in accordance with this information. The total result, however, of everything I have mentioned, so even some people who had an empty doctrine of this, like they had the doctrine but it was kind of empty, still exerted something in themselves. So there's all these different people cognizing and trying to move on the path, and what is the total result that happens to society? However, of everything I have mentioned was that within 10 terrestrial years there had disappeared of their own accord those two chief forms of ordinary being existence abnormally established there, from which there chiefly flow and still continue to flow most of the maleficent causes, the totality of which engenders all kinds of trifling factors which prevent the establishment of conditions there for at least a normal outer being existence for these unfortunate favorites of yours. So he doesn't actually say, but apparently a society at large, at least around, which felt influence from Ashiata Shaimash, managed to eliminate two chief features. Well, chief feature is actually a technical term from Gurdjieff's work, but two attributes of the remnant of the organ of Kundabhatha were eliminated from everybody within a certain radius. That's very interesting. And namely, firstly, their division into numerous communities with various forms of organization for external and even internal existence, whereas they themselves express state organizations ceased to exist. Okay, so is that a thing? State organizations ceased to exist? And secondly, in these said numerous communities, there also disappeared equally from their own accord those various what are called castes or classes, which had long before been established there. That's interesting. So castes, the caste system is a functioning of the organ Kundabhatha. I don't know about that, Gurdjieff. I don't know about that at all, but that's very interesting. So what society eliminated state organizations and castes near Babylon? Well, that's the Mazdakites right there. They have a very interesting history. So Ashiata Shaimash, he has a connection to Hermes Trismegistus, to Zarathustra, and also to Mazdak, or Mazda, or whoever founded the Mazdakites. Very interesting. G is anarchist, hell yeah. Says Tyler, I don't know, yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know. Maybe he's just a fan of Max Stirner. And in my opinion, as you also will surely understand, eventually, it was precisely this second of the two mentioned chief abnormally established forms of ordinary being existence, namely the assigning of each other to different classes or castes, that had specifically... They had castes, they had castes in, like, Atlantis, bro. That's what kings were. I don't know this right. Anyway, become there the basis for the gradual crystallization of the common presences of these unfortunate favorites. So maybe he means like fake castes. but there's like a true internal, like, someone maybe internally a king or something. I'll let him explain. Let's let Gurdjieff speak for himself. Unfortunate favorites of yours of that particular psychic property which, in the whole of the universe, is inherent exclusively only in the presences of those three-brained beings. Okay. This exclusively particular property was formed in them soon after the second Transylvanian perturbation there, so after the tragic demise of Atlantis, and gradually undergoing development and becoming strengthened in them was passed from generation to generation by heredity, until it has now already passed to the contemporary beings as a certain lawful and inseparable part of their general psyche. And this particular property of their psyche is called by themselves egoism. Ooh. So, it's funny I mentioned Max Stirner because people kind of call his philosophy egoism, or like they're the egoists. But that's kind of an incorrect translation as well, because Max Stirner, his book is called The Ego on Its Own, but that is a mistranslation. Stirner predates Freud and psychoanalysis, so I think they came out with a recent translation of Stirner's, and it has a completely different name. It's called like The Unique and His Property. But it makes me wonder, did Gurdjieff read German? Gurdjieff clearly knew some stuff about Nietzsche, and maybe through Nietzsche he heard a little stuff about Stirner. But anyway, egoism. Let's see what he says. I think Gurdjieff has definitely read Freud as well, or has brushed up against psychoanalysis. So let's see what's going on here. Inseparable part of their general psyche, this particular property of theirs is called egoism. Sometime later, because remember, Gurdjieff doesn't use the term ego. Gurdjieff uses essence and personality. Essence is the thing that you have or you are. Essence is the thing that you are, and personality is everything that you've collected. So what does he mean by this? Sometime later, in its appropriate place, during my further tales concerning the three-brained beings existing on the planet Earth, I shall also explain to you in detail how, thanks to those conditions of external being existence, which were established there, your favorites first began assigning each other to various castes, and how, thanks to subsequent similar abnormalities, this same maleficent form of mutual relationship, then established there, has continued even until now. But meanwhile, concerning this exceptionally particular property of their general psyche, namely egoism, it is necessary for you to know that the cause of the possibility of the arising in their common presences of this particular property was that owing always to the same abnormal conditions established from the very beginning after the said second Transylvanian perturbation, their general psyche had become dual. Okay, this is interesting. So forget about our subconscious or our higher consciousness. Our normal waking consciousness is dual. This became fully evident to me when, or maybe he's talking about conscious and subconscious divide. Let's see what he says. This became fully evident to me, says Beelzebub, when, during the period of my last sojourn on the surface of this planet of yours, I became deeply interested in the mentioned legomenisms. So this is the style of teaching that Ashiata Shamash uses, concerning the deliberations of the very saintly Ashiata Shamash, entitled The Terror of the Situation. I began, in the course of my further detailed researches and investigations relating to his subsequent very saintly activities and their results, to investigate the causes in which way and why the crystallization of the mentioned factors obtained from the particles of the emanation of the sorrow of our common Father Creator for the actualizing of the divine being impulse of objective consciousness proceeded in their presences, that is to say, just in their said subconsciousness, and thus avoided that final degeneration to which are subject all the data placed in them for engendering in their presences the being impulses, faith, love, and hope. So this is interesting. Because the conscience, the divine conscience, went into the subconsciousness, it was protected from being warped by our wrong, false consciousness, basically. So being impulses of faith, hope, and love, we have consciously, but they become warped because of the consequences of the Organkunde buffer. But our conscience hasn't. So we need to evoke our conscience, connect to it, and have it guide us as a being impulse, and it will regenerate, perhaps may help regenerate these. And I was convinced that this strange anomaly there justifies one of the numerous wise sentences of our highly esteemed, irreplaceable, and honorable Mullah Nasruddin, which states, "Every real happiness for man can arise exclusively only from some unhappiness also real, which he has already experienced." What? Every real happiness from man can arise exclusively only from some unhappiness also real, which he has already experienced. It's an interesting statement. So real happiness can only arise from real unhappiness. The mentioned duality. So basically, if you haven't suffered enough, if you've lived only in luxury and you haven't suffered, your happiness is just ephemeral. Maybe that's what he's saying. Anyway, the mentioned duality of their general psyche proceeded because, on the one hand, various what are called individual initiates began to issue from that localization arising in their presences, which is always predominant during their waking existence, which localization is nothing else but only the result of the accidental perceptions of impressions coming from without and engendered by their abnormal environment, which perceptions in totality are called by them their consciousness. That's interesting. We got some Buddhist skandhas coming up. So people call what people call their consciousness are just a bundle of perceptions of impressions that have impressed on them. Okay. And on the other hand, similar individual initiatives also began to issue in them, as it is proper to them from that normal localization existing in the presences of every kind of being, and which they call their subconsciousness. Okay. So we have localizations. So we have centers of gravity. And the center, basically, impressions that come to us through our senses. So nature, well, what nature we see physically, our society, our family, our friends, social norms, all of those perceptions come into us, into our waking consciousness, and that's what we call, they localize and become a personality. But there's also some other things that impress into us, but just impress into our subconsciousness. So it's like our subconsciousness becomes another individual which we can then talk to. And we can also feed it. And because the mentioned individual initiatives issue from such different localizations during their waking existence, each of them, during the process of his daily existence, is, as it were, divided into two independent personalities. Here it must be remarked that just this said duality was also the cause that there was gradually lost from their presences that impulse necessary to three-brained beings, which is called sincerity. So sincerity is lost because of this divide. Later, the practice of deliberately destroying the just mentioned being impulse called sincerity even took root among them, and now from the day of their arising, or as they say, from the day of their birth, the three-brained beings there are accustomed by their producers, or as they say, parents, producers, boy, you want a producer? To an entirely contrary impulse, namely deceit. Our producers teach us how to deceive. What's the... You don't have parents, you have producers. This is like a P.T. Barnum thing? Every moment a sucker is born. So, to teach and to suggest to their children how to be insincere with others and deceitful in everything has become so ingrained in the beings of the planet Earth of the present time that it has even become their conception of their duty towards their children, and this kind of conduct towards their children they call by the famous word education. Yeah. I mean, do we even get that nowadays? They educate their children never to be able to dare to do as the conscience presence in them instinctively directs, but only that which is prescribed in the manuals of bon ton, usually drawn up there just by various candidates for Hasnamuses. Drops mic, yeah, exactly. Ugh. Ugh. So we're taught not to follow our conscience. We're taught to, you need to follow the rules. And who makes the rules? Hasnamuses. It's all like, when you see like people being, and like they get Hollywood actors to come up and be like, you need to do the right thing and doing it. It's like, man, whenever there's a scandal in Hollywood, it always comes out that like all of the Hollywood actors that you know and love are literally the most degenerate people you know. And you just like, whenever I see them being like, yeah, and then, this actor came out and he said, we all got to do the right thing and that inspired me. Why? Why? They're like the worst people you know. Our stars, the stars that we follow are the worst people in the entire world. And you want to follow them instead of your own conscience? Nah, dog. Forget the politics. Forget what politicians say. Forget what the rules are. I would rather trust a random account on Twitter than I would trust a politician. Anyway. And of course, when these children grow up and become responsible beings, they already automatically produce their manifestations and their acts, just as during their formation they were taught, just as they were suggested to, and just as they were wound up, in a word, just as they were educated, and wound up as in like a clockwork thing. Yeah. I would rather trust a Twitter account called BallsDeep69 to teach me about world politics than the news. Is that an actual account? I'm not going to look it up. You can check it up later. There's some random dude just spitting facts on Twitter. Yeah, people with names like that always have interesting political takes. Now, moving forward. Thanks to all this, the conscience, which might be in the consciousness of beings of that planet, is, from their earliest infancy, gradually driven back within, so that by the time they are grown up, the said conscience is already found only in what they call their subconsciousness. So, okay. So this is how we end up in the situation we are. So this is valuable stuff here. In consequence, the functioning of the mentioned data for engendering in their presences this said divine impulse, conscience, gradually ceased long ago to participate in that consciousness of theirs by means of which their waking existence flows. Yes. That is why, my boy, the crystallization in their common presences of the divine manifestation issuing from above for the data of the arising of this sacred being impulse in them proceeds only in their subconsciousness. So it's interesting, there are subconscious processes in us all the time that are connecting to higher forces. But our conscience, our consciousness, our waking consciousness just doesn't access it. Break the rules, people. Which has ceased to participate in the process of their ordinary daily existence. And that is why these data have escaped that degeneration to which all the other sacred being impulses were subject. Very interesting. And which they also ought to have in their presences, namely the impulses faith, love, and hope. Furthermore, if for some reason or other the actions of the divine data crystallized in their presences for the said being impulse should now begin to manifest themselves in them from their subconsciousness, and should strive to participate in their functioning of their abnormally formed ordinary consciousness, then no sooner are they aware of it than they at once take measures to avoid it. So as soon as you feel your conscience, you're like, nope, time to drink. because it has already become impossible in the conditions already existing there for anyone to exist with a functioning in their presences of this divine impulse of genuine objective consciousness. So if you actually felt most people, if they felt actual remorse for something, they're like, nah, we can't feel remorse for our actions. We're justified. You are a victim, honey. It's everyone else who's the problem. From the time when the said egoism had become completely inoculated in the presences of your favorites, this particular being property became, pardon me, in its turn, the fundamental contributory factor in the gradual crystallization in their general psyche of the data for the arising of still several other quite exclusively particular being impulses now existing there under the names of cunning, envy, hate, hypocrisy, contempt, haughtiness, servility, slyness, ambition, double-facedness. So basically Instagram and Facebook, and so on and so forth. You're just wait a second, you're just describing all the politicians? But you're just describing what it takes to succeed in the world. Come on, man. Parsa says, hey, love from Iran, great work. Hey, thanks, Parsa. Thank you, King. These exclusively particular properties of their psyche, which I have just named, utterly unbecoming to three-brained beings, were already fully crystallized in the presences of most of your favorites, and where the inevitable attributes of the psyche of every one of them, even before the period of the very saintly Ashyata Shaimash. But when there began to be fixed, and to flow automatically in the process of their being existence, the new form of existence intentionally implanted in them by Ashyata Shaimash himself, then these strange properties previously present in their psyche entirely disappeared from their presences of most of the three-brained beings there. So this is interesting. It's like, instead of fighting against these things individually, we need to fight against hate. Stop hate. Instead of fighting against cunning, trying to make rules or laws to stop ambitions or dark ambitions, to stop yourself from trying from hypocrisies. It's a specific type of education that turns inwards. That if practiced, that if you're able to feel remorse and that conscience, it completely destroys those results and frees you. So I just completely lost my place. Where am I? And they began to be fixed and to flow automatically. Previously present in their psyche entirely disappeared, from the presences of most of the brain beings there. So that's really revolutionary that Ashyata Shaimash managed to do that. So, and it's very, there's some powers in the subconsciousness which we need to access. Later, however, when they themselves destroyed all the results of the very saintly labors of this essence-loving Ashyata Shaimash, these same psychic properties, maleficent for themselves, gradually again arose anew in all of them. And for them, the contemporary three-brained beings there, they are already the foundation of the whole of their existence. Of the whole of their essence, sorry. Alas. Well then, my boy, when the data arose in the common presences of your favorites for engendering this unique particular being impulse egoism, and when gradually evolving and giving rise to factors ensuing from it for other, also particular but now secondary strange being impulses, this said unique property, oh baby, he definitely has read Stirner. Egoism usurped the place of the unique all-autocratic ruler in their general organization. Then not only every manifestation, but even what is called the desire for the arising of such a divine being impulse became a hindrance to the actions of this all-autocratic ruler. And in consequence of this, when eventually your favorites had already, by force of necessity, both consciously and unconsciously, always in everything prevented it partaking in the function of that consciousness of theirs, through the control of which it had become proper for them to actualize their waking existence, the actions of those divine data were gradually, as it were, removed from the functioning of their ordinary consciousness, and participated only in the functioning of their said subconsciousness. So they may not feel remorse, but they may subconsciously punish themselves for the things that they do. Hence, fate or karma punishes them. Very interesting. And it was only after my detailed researches and investigations had made all the foregoing clear to me that I understood why there arose and why there still exists that division of them there into various classes or castes, which is particularly maleficent for them. My later detailed researches and investigations very definitely and clearly showed me that in the consciousness of theirs, which they call their subconsciousness, even in the beings of the present time, the said data for the acquisition in their presences of the fundamental divine impulse conscience does indeed still continue to be crystallized and hence to be present during the whole of their existence. Okay, so there's always still hope, even up to this very day. There's still hope. We've still got this, guys. We can still do it. And that these data for this divine being impulse are still crystallized, and their manifestations still continue to participate in the process of their being existence, was apart from the said being investigations, further confirmed by the fact that I frequently had a good deal of difficulty on account of it, during the periods of my observation of them from the planet Mars. The point is, tell us, Gurdjieff, tell us the point, is that through my Tescuano, his telescope, the Beelzebub's telescope, from the planet Mars, I could freely observe without any difficulty whatsoever the existence proceeding on the surfaces of the other planets of that solar system, but making my observations of the process of the existence proceeding on the surface of your planet was, owing to the special coloration of its atmosphere, a real misery. And this special correlation occurred, as I later ascertained, because there appeared from time to time in the presence of this atmosphere large quantities of those crystallizations which were frequently radiated from the presences of these favorites of yours, owing to that particular impulse which they themselves called remorse of conscience. Okay, let's go. And this proceeded because in those of them who chanced to receive and experience some kind of what is called shock to organic shame, the associations proceeding from their previous impressions almost always become changed, calmed, and sometimes even for a time entirely cease in them, which associations, as I have already told you, consist mostly of various kinds of what is called rubbish. Very interesting. In consequence, so sometimes, every now and then you just feel it. You're like, oof, I'm not what I should be. And you just get a little single tear. Little single manly tear, like you get that little shock to organic shame just comes in every now and then. It's the subconscious there being like, come on man, what are you doing? Stop doom scrolling. In consequence, there is then automatically obtained in these three-brained beings there such a combination of functioning in their common presences as temporarily frees the data presence in their subconsciousness for the manifestation of the divine impulse conscience, and for its participation in the functioning of their ordinary consciousness. Okay. With the result that this said remorse of consciousness precedes them. Because, sometimes, you look back on events and you're like, man, those guys were assholes. And then just years later, you're just not even thinking about it. And then, like, the memories come back, but reframed differently. And you're like, oh shit, it was me. I was the asshole all along. Things like that are reframed when you really feel remorse. I like one guy said, you live your life through levels of comprehension. And that's seen where, when you're in your like teens and you look back and you're like, man, when I was a kid, I was dumb. And then when you're in your 20s, you look back into your teens and you're like, man, I was such an idiot. And when you're in your mid-20s, you look back at early 20s, like, God, that guy was so dumb. And then you're at your 30s, you're like, man, mid-20s, I was such an idiot. You're continuously in this process of comprehension of self. So the problem is with most people, comprehension is triggered via pain and suffering. The idea is, can you trigger comprehension another way? Now, let's keep going. Let's see what Gurdjieff says. And as this remorse of conscience gives rise to the mentioned particular crystallizations, which issue from them, with their other radiations, the result is that the totality of all these radiations occasionally gives the atmosphere of this planet of yours that particular correlation which hinders the being organ of sight from penetrating freely through it. So is it just because humans are being sad boys, sad boy emos, like is sad boy emo stuff? Is that why it releases a kind of a psychic substance which stops alien telescopes from seeing us clearly? But it's remorse conscience. What are these radiations? Let's see what he says. Let's see what he says. Here it is necessary to say that these favorites of yours, particularly the contemporary ones, become ideally expert in not allowing this inner impulse of theirs called remorse of conscience to linger longer in their common presences. No sooner do they begin to sense the beginning, or even only, so to say, the prick of the arising of the functioning in them of such a being impulse, then they immediately, as it is said, squash it. Whereupon this impulse, not yet quite formed in them, at once calms down. For this squashing of the beginning of any remorse of conscience in themselves, they have even invented some very efficient special means, which now exist there under the names of alcoholism, cocainism, morphine, nicotinism, onanism. If you don't know what that is, let's just say teenage boys do it a lot. I guess teenage girls do it a lot nowadays as well. Monkism, so people escape from reality. Athenianism, is he just saying like, what is he even alluding to of that? Democracy was invented to stop us from feeling remorse. Anyway, I mean, hey, if a democracy, in a way I say that as a joke, but if the masses choose, then you can always blame not the leader, but it's all those other voters. It's the liberals. It's all their fault, or it's the Republicans. Anyway, others with names ending in isms, yeah. Mainly a lot of alcoholisms. I think alcoholism definitely is a big one. I repeat, my boy, at a suitable occasion, I shall explain to you in detail also about those results issuing from the abnormally established conditions. Athena war? Well, I was thinking more, Tyler says Athena equals war, and I'm like, I'm thinking more of like, you know what the Greeks did with, you know what Socrates did with young boys? Is he referencing that? I don't know. This is like, Gurdjieff's like humor coming through, I think, here. But let's move on. Let's move on. So the results are issuing from the abnormally established conditions of ordinary existence there, which became factors for the arising and permanent existence there of this, for them, maleficent assignment of themselves to various castes. I shall without fail explain to you, because the information elucidating this abnormality there may serve as very good data for your further logical comparisons, for the purpose of better understanding the strangeness of the psyche of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy. Goddamn, how long is this chapter? My God. Meanwhile, transubstantiate, very interesting that he uses this term, in yourself the following. When the mentioned particular psychic property of egoism had been completely formed in the common present. So egoism here he's using as a negative term to mean these bad properties coagulating into the waking conscious state of a person, had been completely formed in the common presences of these favorites of yours. And later, there had also been formed in them various other secondary impulses already mentioned by me, which ensued and now will still continue to ensue from it, and furthermore in consequence of the total absence of the participation of the impulse of sacred conscience. In their waking consciousness, then these three-brained beings arising and existing on the planet Earth. Alice, 7 more pages. We've got this. Let's go. Let's go. Of Earth, both before the period of the very saintly activities of Ashiat Shaimash, and also since, have always striven and still continue to strive to arrange their welfare during the process of their ordinary existence, exclusively for themselves. And as in general, on none of the planets of our great universe does there or can there exist enough of everything required for everybody's equal external welfare, irrespective of what are called objective merits. The result there is that the prosperity of one is always built on the adversity of many. It is just this exclusive regard for their own personal welfare that has gradually crystallized in them the already quite particularly unprecedented and peculiar properties of their psyche which I cited, as for instance cunning, contempt, hate, servility, lying, flattery, and so on, which in their turn, on the one hand, are factors for outer manifestation unbecoming to three-brained beings, and on the other hand are the cause of gradual destruction of all those inner possibilities of theirs, placed in them by great nature, of becoming particles of the whole, of the reasonable whole. So because of a lack of resources for our external welfare, we have basically become cunning, lying flatterers. We're basically becoming a world of Hasnamusans. Psychopathy, basically. Well then, my boy, at the time when the results of the very saintly labors, and it's not just that we're becoming a world of Hasnamusans, but it's becoming just and correct to be a basically be psycho. Well then, my boy, at the time when the results of the very saintly labors of the essence-loving Ashiata Shayamash had already begun to blend with the processes of what is called their inner and outer being existence, so the conscious and the subconscious blends, and when, thanks to this, data for divine impulse conscience striving in their subconsciousness gradually began to share in the functioning of their waking consciousness, then the being existence, both personal and reciprocal, began to proceed on this planet also, almost as it does on other planets of our great universe on which three-brained beings exist. These favorites of yours also then began to have relations towards each other only as towards the manifestations varying in the degree of a unique common creator, and to pay respect to each other only according to the merits. Personal, so instead of paying respect to someone because of their caste, it's only towards their merit. Personally attained by means of being park dog duty, that is, by means of personal conscious labors and intentional sufferings. That is why, during that period, there ceased to exist there the said two chief maleficent forms of their ordinary existence, namely the separate independent communities and the divisions of themselves in these communities into various castes or classes. At that time also, there upon your planet, all the three-brained beings began to consider themselves and those like themselves merely as beings bearing in themselves particles of the emanation of the sorrow of our common Father, Creator. So we must feel the sorrow of God. Very mystic. I can see where, like, Ouspensky was like, Gurdjieff is becoming too mystical. And kind of, Ouspensky kind of broke off. But yeah. And all this so happened because when the actions of the data of the divine being impulse began to participate in the functioning of their ordinary waking consciousness, and the three-brained beings began manifesting themselves towards each other, solely in accordance with conscience, the consequence was that masters ceased to deprive their slaves of freedom, and various power-possessing beings of their own accord surrendered their unmerited rights, having become aware by conscience and seeming that they possessed and occupied these rights and positions not for the common welfare, but only for the satisfaction of their various personal weaknesses, such as, for instance, as vanity, self-love, self-calming, and so on. So, communism. But not communism, just the natural state of man. Maybe communism as a political ideology is like a weird kind of reflection that's trying to reach this state, but communism as a political ideology always fails because of the consequences of the Kundabuffer organ. So if you really wanted it to succeed, you would eliminate the consequences of the Kundabuffer organ and it would just proceed naturally. The true revolution is internal. Of course, at that period also, there continued to be all kinds of chiefs, directors, and advisor specialists who became such chiefly from difference of age and from what is called essence power. So this is the true caste system. Just as there are everywhere on all planets of the universe on which there breed three-brained beings of varying degrees of self-perfecting, and they then became such neither by heredity, right, nor by election, as was the case before this blissful Asiatan epoch, and as again afterwards became, and even till now continues to be the case. All these chiefs, directors, and advisors then became such in accordance with the objective merits they personally acquired, and which could be really sensed by all the beings around them. And it proceeded in the following way. Oh, Jesus Christ. All the beings of this planet then began to work in order to have their consciousness, this divine function of genuine conscience, and for this purpose, as everywhere in the universe, they transubstantiated in themselves what are called the being obligonian strivings, yeah baby, which consists of the following five, namely, so these are important. The first striving, to have in their ordinary being existence everything satisfying and really necessary for their planetary body. So you can't neglect your planetary body, you have to strive to have it balanced, to live a balanced life, basically. You don't need luxury, you need leisure. The second, so you gotta work, you gotta keep it healthy. Now, second striving, to have constant and unflagging instinctive need for self-perfection in the sense of being. So this is the second being striving activates. I mean, maybe they're all active, but the second one can be acted upon once the first one has been actualized. So you want self-perfection. Third, the conscious striving to know ever more and more concerning the laws of world creation and world maintenance. So when you try to perfect yourself, you start hitting a wall. Why? The microcosm needs to understand the macrocosm, so you start to gain knowledge of world creation and world maintenance. The fourth one, the striving from the beginning of their existence to pay for their arising in their individuality as quickly as possible, in order afterwards to be free to lighten as much as possible the sorrow of our common father. So once you understand the macrocosm, you connect it to the microcosm, you do perfect yourself. In other words, you do arise a true individuality as quickly as possible. This then lightens the sorrow. You release God from the sorrow that he has watching us exist. And the fifth, the striving always to assist the most rapid perfecting of other beings, both those similar to oneself and those of other forms, up to the degree of the sacred Mata Fati. That is, up to the degree of self-individuality. So if you look at these being strivings, it's very interesting, because you can see what would happen if people were not given a metaphysical framework and they're just taught that only material exists, only mechanisms exist. Reductionist mechanistic materialism exists, and you can only exist in that paradigm. What happens? Your first being striving, okay, yeah, got to get business, got to get money. Self-perfection, what does it happen? You just focus on the body, you just focus on getting muscles. Maybe you learn some things about the laws of the universe, maybe you learn some manifestation techniques or whatever. But your mastery, your individuality, it's only external, like you become a chess master, you become a master boxer or something like that, a champion boxer or a champion MMA fighter. And then fifth, you then teach those lesser than you, you then teach people below you. I became an entrepreneur, I'm going to help others. There's these things, these being strivings can be not inverted, but they can be materialized. While the real ones acting purely, the true self-perfection is the creation of higher being bodies within ourselves. That's what we're trying to do. Sacred Mata Fati. At this period, when every terrestrial three-centered being existed and worked consciously upon himself in accordance with these five strivings, many of them, thanks to this, quickly arrived at the results of objective attainments perceptible by others. So they became so hardcore, even others were like, damn, that guy's good. Of course, these objective attainments then as it is said, attracted the attention of all around them, who thereupon made those who had attained stand out from their midst and pay them every kind of respect. They also strove with joy to merit the attention of these outstanding beings, and to have for themselves their counsel and advice, how they themselves could attain the same perfecting. So a very natural initiate-led society arose. And these outstanding beings of that period began in their turn to make the most attained among themselves stand out, and this outstanding being thereby automatically became, without either hereditary or other right, the chief of them all, and recognizing him as chief. So just by pure competence, everyone was like, damn, this guy's good, let's have him run things. His directings were spread correspondingly, and his recognition included not only the separate neighboring parts of the surface of your planet, but also even the neighboring continents and islands. At that period, the counsel and guidance, and in general, every word of these chiefs became law for all the three-brained beings there, and were fulfilled by them with devotion and joy, not as it had proceeded there before the results obtained by the very saintly labors of Ashiat Shaimash, nor as it again proceeded and still continues to proceed, since they themselves destroyed the fruits of his very saintly labors. That is to say, these strange three-brained beings of your favorites now carry out the various commands and orders of their chiefs, and as they are called kings, only from fear of what are called bayonets and lousy cells, of which there are a great many at the disposition of these chiefs and kings. So degeneration sets in. The results of the very saintly labors of Ashiat Shaimash were then also very definitely reflected in respect of that terrible peculiarity of the manifestation of the psyche of yours, namely, in their irresistible urge for the periodic destruction of each other's existence. The process of reciprocal destruction established there and ensuing from the terrible particularity of their psyche entirely ceased on the continent Asia, and only proceeded occasionally on those large and small parts of the surface of that planet of yours, which were far from the continent Asia. And this continued there only because, owing to their distance and influence of the initiates and priests, could not reach and be transubstantiated in the presence of the beings proceeding on these parts of the surface of your planet. Woo! Okay, so they had a little paradise for a moment. Just a moment, though. But the most astonishing and significant result of the very saintly labors of Ashiat Shaimash was that at the period, not only did the duration of the existence of these unfortunates become a little more normal, that is to say, it began to increase, but also what they call the death rate also diminished, and at the same time, the number of their results manifested for the prolongation of their generation. That is, as they say, their birth rate diminished to at least a fifth. So people stopped making babies, but they also stopped dying. Thereby, there was even practically demonstrated one of the cosmic laws, namely what is called the law of the equilibration of vibrations, that is, of vibrations arising from the evolutions and involutions of the cosmic substances required for the most great omnicosmic trogo-auto-egocrat. The said decline in both their death rate and birth rate proceeded, because as they approximated to an existence normal for the three-centered beings, they also began to radiate from themselves vibrations responding more closely to the requirements of great nature, thanks to which nature needed less of those vibrations which are in general obtained from the destruction of the existence of beings. So, Green Party, you want us to stop making babies? The revolution is internal. Have people eliminate the consequence of the organ Kunda buffer, and it will naturally, our population's controls will naturally equilibrate. You will also understand well about this cosmic law, equilibration of vibrations, when at the proper time I shall explain to you in detail, as I have already many times promised you, concerning all the general fundamental cosmic laws. It was just in this way, my boy, and in such a sequence that there, in that period, thanks to the conscious labors of the very saintly Ashiat Shaimash, the said welfare, unprecedented for your favorites, was gradually created. But to the infinite sorrow of all more or less consciously thinking individuals of all gradations of reason. Shortly after the departure from this planet of the very saintly Ashiata Shayamash, these unfortunates themselves, after the manner that had become in general proper to them before, in respect of every good attainment of their ancestors, totally destroyed it all. And thus it was they destroyed, and thus it was they swept away from the surface of their planet all that welfare, so that even the rumor has failed to reach contemporary beings there that once upon a time such bliss existed. In certain inscriptions which have survived from ancient times, and have reached the contemporary beings of that planet, there is, however, some information that there once existed on their planet what is called a special kind of state organization, and that at the head of every state were beings of the highest attainments. And on the basis of this information, the contemporary beings have invented just a mere name for this state organization. They call it a priest organization, theocracy, and that is all. But what constituted this priest organization? How and why it was? Is it not all the same to the contemporary beings of the planet Earth? What ancient savages did? Exclamation points. This is very Gurdjieff asking in desperation there, like, what? How? What constituted it, though? You guys aren't asking the right questions. And we finally reach the next chapter, the chief culprit in the destruction of all the very saintly labors of Ashiata Shamash. Ooh, we're going to hear about Hasnamusens. But that'll be for next week. Oh my god. Oh. Okay. So, thank you all for coming along on that journey. That was quite a ride. Join us again next week. If you wilt. Absolutely bang a chapter. Yes, it was, Tyler. Yes, it was. We had the Obligolinian being strivings there. They're very important. They're very important. So we'll pick up where we were next week. We'll pick up on chapter 28 next week. And in the meantime, if you want to help support the channel, please do. There, one-time donation on PayPal. There's the Ko-fi account. You can set up a monthly donation to, or you can become a YouTube member and get some perks. Got some merchandise on the way. Some more content coming. Gonna get around to that Political Compass Chapter 3. I know people have been asking about it. We'll get there. We'll get there, boys. We'll get there. Anyway. Till the future. See you guys around. Bye.